and welcome. I'm Professor Philip Lorenz from the Departments of Literatures in English and Comparative Literature here at Cornell. And it's my privilege today to introduce the 2021 Paul Gottschalk Memorial Lecture. But before we begin, just a couple of quick reminders. Please turn your cell phones to silent. And after the talk, there will be time for question and answer session and informal conversation. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, okay. The Gottschalk Memorial Lecture is an endowed lecture established in memory of Paul Gottschalk, professor of English at Cornell and a scholar of British Renaissance literature. He's the author of The Meanings of Hamlet, Modes of Literary Interpretation since A.C. Bradley, which examines a variety of critical methodologies, interpretive schools of thought, stagings of that thought, and various implications of for literary study, particularly studies of the English Renaissance. Professor Gottschalk died in 1977 at the age of 38. The Gottschalk Lectures were established in his honor. In his honor, and taking as their point of departure the title of Professor Gottschalk's work, and particularly the multiplicity of the word meanings in his book on Hamlet's title, the Gottschalk Lectures have explored an astonishing range of ways that early modern thought and culture, its social, political, and intellectual conflicts, its wide array of complex, discursive, and other formations, continue to not merely historically underlie, but also often actively shape late modern thought and practice. Among the many illustrious scholars who have given the Gottschalk Lectures, previous speakers have included Janet Edelman, Stanley Cavell, Anne Middleton, Annabelle Patterson. The list is long, but I hesitate to leave people out. Neil Hertz, Valerie Traub, Peter Stallybrast, Harry Berger, John Guillory, Stephen Greenblatt, Jonathan Goldberg, Lynn Enterline, Carolyn Dinshaw, Juliet Fleming, Jeffrey Maston, Richard Rambus, Patricia Parker, Maureen Quilligan, Victoria Kahn, Roland Green, Margareta de Grazia, Richard Halpern, Kim Hall, and Suzanne Akbari. Needless to say, these are some of the luminaries of the field of early modern literary and cultural studies. It's truly an extraordinary list, to which it's now my honor and great pleasure, frankly, to introduce today's speaker, Professor James Simpson. Donald P. and Catherine B. Locher Professor of English at Harvard University. Professor Simpson was previously Professor of Medieval and Renaissance English at the University of Cambridge. Professor Simpson is a Life Fellow of Girton College and an Honorary Fellow of the Australian Academy of the Humanities. He has many books on medieval and early modern thought and culture, including Sciences and the Self in Medieval Poetry, Alain de Lisle's Anti-Claudianus, and John Gower's Confessio Amantis, Reform and Cultural Revolution, 1350-1547, which won the British Academy Sir Israel Golan's Prize, Burning to Read, English Fundamentalism and its Reformation Opponents, fantastic, I'm reading it right now, I really recommend it, winner of the silver medal in the 2008 Independent Publisher Book Awards in the category of religion, Under the Hammer, Iconoclasm and the Anglo-American Tradition, and Permanent Revolution, the Reformation and the illiberal roots of liberalism, to which I believe some of his talk today might refer. Professor Simpson's talk today focuses on one of the absolute tenets of Anglo-American cultures, many say Western cultures, perhaps their holding principle or abiding belief, liberalism. I do not need to tell you how central this tenet is to contemporary cultural and political questions and problems today. In fact, just today, the announcement for the 2022 Telos Conference, Telos is the title of a journal, the subtitle of which is Critical Theory of the Contemporary. The TELO, or Theory of the Contemporary Conference in New York, is titled Civilizational States and Liberal Empire, Bound to Collide. The notion that liberalism and civilization may have something oppositional about them is something that I think we might hear about later this afternoon also. In any case, questions such as these have histories, and as Professor Simpson will no doubt discuss, our liberalism or liberalisms have histories that are particularly fraught, self-divided, contradictory, ambivalent if not paranoid, and certainly complex. Much of this complexity emerges around questions of textuality, interpretation, and reading, and not a little of it leads to recurring violence. These early modern histories and their contradictory origins, in other words, continue to shape late modern understandings of identity, authority, and textuality in ways that both orient and disorient us. Today, we will undoubtedly learn some of the different ways to think about these orientations or disorientations and their histories. So now please join me in warmly welcoming Professor James Simpson.
Well, thank you very much, Philip. How comforting it is that some institutions continue to observe this antique and antiquated custom of inviting real people to give in-person talks. I'm thrilled to be here. This is the first time I've worn a tie, I think, in more than 2 years. I'm very excited. I'm especially excited to be here in person to deliver the Paul Gottschalk Memorial Lecture. But how especially comforting it is, exciting, honouring it is to be doing this at Cornell, that this invitation should have come from Cornell. I first read Jonathan Culler's Structuralist Poetics in 1977, a totally electrifying book, and ever since then, Cornell, for me, has been a kind of beacon of scholarly brilliance and of deep learning. It would be invidious for me to go through each of the scholars who have, in a kind of layered effect, created this thick texture of Cornell brilliance and learning. But for me, Cornell, as I say, is the model, or at least a very powerful model, of a long-running sequence of brilliant scholars and a very great English department. I thank Andy Galloway for his generous and welcome invitation, Philip Lawrence for his kind hospitality, and I just also mention Lynn Lauper as a really exceptional administrator who is a wonderfully efficient person. So, let us turn to these grand questions, which I'm afraid I shall be bound to disappoint after Philip's really promising and very interesting introduction. But in my view, ecclesiology, that is, what defines the true church, who is in, who is out, what defines the true church, ecclesiology is the great guiding force of historical periodization in Europe up at least to, probably well beyond, the 18th century. It's ecclesiology that drives historiography and the senses of where the divisions fall in historiographical periodization. Given that, it's significant that the Whig liberal tradition needed and still needs to be triumphalist about early British modernity, since that was when Britain achieved liberty by breaking free of the Catholic Church. A new definition of ecclesiology, a new driver for historiographical periodization. Looked at from the present back to the Glorious Revolution and the reforms that followed the Glorious Revolution, 1689. Looking back from the present to 1688, early British modernity looks worthy of triumphalism to liberals. But the damaging problem with this approach is, however, that it sweeps up the Reformation, 16th and 17th centuries, into the triumphalism. As a late medievalist, I come at the Reformation not from the present, looking back to 1688, but rather from the other historical side of it, from the pre-Reformation past, looking forwards to the Reformation beginning in 1517. And from that vantage point, things look pretty bad to a liberal. Where the liberal triumphalists see liberty, I see the following. I see an absolutist, despair-producing, merit-denying account of salvation. I see an exclusivist, invisible, ahistorical church. I see stringent insistence on the literalist inerrancy of Scripture, an insistence which inevitably produces extraordinary amounts of violence. I see destructive iconoclasm, and in its early phases, the early phases of the English Reformation, I see political quietism, even in the face of tyranny. It gets a lot worse. The late medievalist who enters the Reformation via 1517 discovers that many of the cultural forms routinely characterized by liberal culture as specifically medieval, read the New York Times and you will have this confirmed at least once a week. These routine cultural forms, these cultural forms routinely characterized by liberal culture as specifically medieval, an abbreviated list would include iconoclasm, slavery, persecution of witches, judicial torture in England, not on the continent, but in England, biblical fundamentalism, political absolutism, for example, that all these cultural forms are in fact specifically early modern phenomena. They're not medieval phenomena. Iconoclasm, slavery, persecution of witches, judicial torture in England, biblical fundamentalism, political absolutism, not medieval phenomena. The late medieval visitor to the Reformation centuries also discovers a massive upshot in religious violence and religious persecution in Western Europe from the mid-16th century. So today I focus on a single aspect of this dark age, the period of the Renaissance and Reformation. I focus on a single aspect of this particularly dark period of cultural history. I focus on its account of merit. The disunited states of our contemporary experience being in good part, in my view, the product of 17th century agonies, this topic, this denial of merit by 16th and 17th century evangelicals, this denial of merit has vital ongoing relevance to current American predicaments. Increasingly vocal anti-democratic antinomianism, i.e. statements that the law is irrelevant to the elect, increasingly vocal anti-democratic antinomianism on the libertarian and ethno-nationalist right, the repudiation of merit by the progressive left, the fixation on the ideal of untrammeled agential freedom by the entire American political spectrum. All these, in my view, emerge as reflexes, one way or another, from the crucible of the 17th century, to which I now turn. It's terrible weather. We have a coup in this country happening day by day. There is a war about to happen in Eastern Europe. You deserve something much cheerier than what I'm talking about. I'm sorry, I have no choice. I would like to be offering you some midwinter cheer. I'm unable to do so. So I'm going to be beginning by turning then to Calvinist understanding, repudiation of human merit. First of all, as expressed by its legislative armature, and then I turn to its literary expression. Excuse me one second. So, between at least 1571 and 1660, the English state legislated against merit. The 39 Articles of the Anglican Church were first formulated in 1563 and formally ratified in 1571, when swearing conformity to the 39 Articles was required of every single minister. Listen, for example, to Article 10 of the 39 Articles of free will. The condition of man after the fall of Adam is such that he cannot turn and prepare himself by his own natural strength and good works to faith and calling upon God. Wherefore, we have no power to do good works pleasant and acceptable to God without the grace of God by Christ preventing us, i.e. coming before us, that we may have a good will and working with us when we have that good will. Articles such as this one, and there are many more, demolish the legal claims of human virtue and merit upon God. They lead ineluctably down a narrow and logical corridor to the mighty and daunting portal of predestination. The 39 Articles themselves seem to balk at the full severity of Calvinist double predestination, whereby God both decides who will be saved and actively decides who will be damned. But the 39 Articles nonetheless state the single form of predestination clearly enough. Thus, Article 17, predestination to life is the everlasting purpose of God, whereby, before the foundations of the world were laid, he hath constantly decreed by his counsel, secret to us, to deliver from curse and damnation those whom he hath chosen in Christ out of mankind, and to bring them by Christ to everlasting salvation, as vessels made to honour. Calvin stands behind this formulation, but Calvin himself, however, hesitates not for a moment in the face of God's inscrutable decision, both to save and to damn for his own good, if wholly inscrutable reasons. Thus, in Calvin's Institution of Christian Religion, which was first published in Latin in 1536, with significant revisions up to 1559, in that text, Calvin is unequivocal. God saves the elect and actively damns the reprobate, and does so from before the beginning of time. By 1561, English readers had handy access to Calvin's doctrine of double predestination, since in that year the playwright and torturer Thomas Norton, playwright of Gorboduc, but also a torturer, translated Calvin's Institutes into English. 11 best-selling editions. This was the best-selling book of the 16th century, right up to 1630. Dwarfs Shakespeare, for example. 11 best-selling editions followed between 1561 and 1634, with 3 abridged editions between 1585 and 1587. And so this is what English readers read there. That, therefore, which the Scripture clearly showeth, we say that God, by eternal and unchangeable counsel, hath once appointed whom in time to come he would take to salvation, and on the other side, whom he would condemn to destruction. This counsel is touching the elect, we say, to be grounded upon his free mercy, without any respect of the worthiness of man. Thus, 1571, the earlier 16th century bookend of legislated absolutist doctrine repudiating human merit. And the later bookend, almost a century later, well, in June 1648, Parliament approved the so-called Westminster Confession of Faith, which was designed in principle in revolutionary, the period of the Republic, which was about to be the period of the Republic, designed in principle to replace the 39 Articles. It was not formally accepted by Parliament until March 1660, by which time, just before the Restoration, that approval was effectively useless. But in 1648, Parliament did approve the Westminster Confession of Faith. Now, in 1571, as we've seen, the bad news about the salvific uselessness of independently performed good works had been a curtain raiser for predestination. But it was single predestination. By 1648, by austere contrast, the order of Calvinist play was reversed. Here, predestination was proclaimed up front and presented in full Calvinist double dress. So Article 3.3 reads thus: by the decree of God, for the manifestation of his glory, some men and angels are predestinated unto everlasting life, and others foreordained to everlasting death. Thus the Westminster Confession, fully ratified in March 1660. I pinpointed 1571 and 1660 as the so-called bookends of almost a century of legislated predestinarian free will demolishing doctrine in early modern England. These bookends are, of course, less precise than the word bookends might suggest, since already in 1547, the state-sponsored mass media Book of Homilies, published for the first time in 1547, and then republished in expanded form in 1563. The Book of Homilies encourages, but then promptly eviscerates, the salutary value of good works. The relevant homily of good works presents the Calvinist truth of the matter of salvation and works that would claim to contribute to salvation in crisply discouraging terms. God encourages us to do good works, but his meaning is not by these words to induce us to have any affiance or to put any confidence in our works as by the merit and deserving of them to purchase to ourselves and others the remission of sin, and so consequently everlasting life, for that were mere blasphemy against God's mercy and a great derogation of the bloodshedding of our Saviour Jesus Christ. So we've got these words encouraging good works. We read them in the Bible. But when we read them, we're not supposed to believe them. We're not supposed to think that they apply to us. We shouldn't have any confidence in our works. That's not what they're there for. They're there for some other purpose, to kind of rub our noses in it, that we can't do them. So before 1571, already in 1547, we've got this. The later bookend, 1660, is also much less definite than 1660 might suggest. In 1660, the Westminster Confession was, as we've seen, replaced by the 39 Articles, Predestinarian Article 17 and all. And those 39 Articles remained in force until at least the Test Act of 1828. So repudiation of merit runs, we might say, not from 1571 to 1660, but rather from 1547 to 1828. Lutheran Calvinist repudiation of works we see in these articles is multiply astonishing. It's really extreme. And such extremity with regard to human virtue has no high-profile precedent in European Mediterranean Christian tradition, except in the late works of Augustine, who died in 430. And yet, the historiography of the Anglo-American Whig tradition, the tradition of liberty, the tradition of liberalism, is for the most part strikingly determined to ignore or deny it. So we turn now to the literary consequences of this psychologically unnerving soteriology. Our examples are drawn from the 17th century English elegiac lyrics by George Herbert. I'm using the word elegiac in a broad sense of to designate a literary mode whereby a solitary speaker who feels abandoned expresses that state of abandonment. Sensitive souls who took this theory of salvation to heart, for such sensitive souls, the solitary, self-centered, agency-crushing experience of redefining one's relation with God was so exhausting as to produce a despairing desire for self-dissolution. That's a compelling topic in its own right and has been magnificently surveyed by John Stachniewski's The Persecutory Imagination, a very great book in my view, published in 1991. Stachniewski himself died prematurely sometime soon after that. It's a book which is still subject to fierce repudiation by Whig, or Protestant triumphalists, let's call it. Tim Rosendale's most recent book is one example of that repudiation. So this desire for self-dissolution is a fascinating topic in itself, but it's also a fascinating topic from a discursive perspective. For the most striking symptom of the radical early modern devaluation of agency is its effect on words, on linguistic utterance. If all agency is worthless, then a shadow must of necessity fall across the act of will implicitly embedded in every utterance. As the self unwillingly retreats from any claim to its own merit, so too correlatively must utterance retreat from the hardwired, mostly unspoken, mostly unspeakable premises of utterance and syntax themselves, i.e., claims to agency. So this section of the talk turns accordingly to works of literature, where the meanings are. I observe there, in these works that we'll be looking at by Herbert, the attempted dissolution of evangelical selfhood and the inevitable twin of that desired dissolution, which is the unraveling of discursive confidence that must accompany and perhaps produces the desire for self-dissolution. Dissolution produces linguistic disintegration. Linguistic disintegration produces a desire for self-dissolution. And I look to the genre best adapted to express the threatened self's predicament on the precipice of history, which is elegiac lyric poetry. As the self longs for its own dissolution, elegiac writing unwrites itself. George Herbert's intense and moving Affliction 4, published, like all these lyrics, posthumously in 1633, Affliction 4 limns an extreme psychopathological and linguistic experience. The narrator has become a wonder by virtue being tortured somewhere between this world and the distant prospect of grace. The condition of language used to express this torture is itself tortured and broken. Both syntax and verse form work. They work. I've suddenly realized I've written. They work. They shouldn't do that. It's against the rules. Both syntax and verse form work to put broken pieces together so as to construct a whole, even if that whole remains as it must, visibly fissured. Let's listen to the first stanza of Affliction 4. Broken in pieces all asunder, Lord, hunt me not, a thing forgot, once a poor creature, now a wonder tortured in the space betwixt this world and that of grace. So much singular pain is palpable and defined in the first 3 lines, in which meter, syntax, narrative are each disrupted. Thus, the measure of the opening tetrameter is metrically interrupted by the staccato irruption of the 2-stressed couplet immediately following. The syntactic link across that metrical dissonance is correlatively stretched to near breaking point. We expect the opening phrase, broken in pieces all asunder, we expect that to qualify the sentence's subject. But that expectation is faced with the need for abrupt readjustment, since the next line, Lord, hunt me not, a 2-stress address to God, brusquely erupts from within the expected syntax. We now understand that the phrase, broken in pieces all asunder, does not qualify the sentence's subject. It agrees instead by a strained hyperbaton inversion of word order. It agrees with the object me. It's part of an accusative phrase. In what we now recognize as an appeal, Lord, hunt me, broken pieces all asunder, not. And so too, our narrative expectation is also shattered All this in the first 3 lines, very short lines. An expected narrative of some talking thing broken in pieces all asunder is suddenly and puzzlingly displaced by an entirely different narrative of an animate creature being hunted. Animate and inanimate jostle uneasily and vie unsuccessfully for narrative control. And these multiple disruptions, metrical, syntactic, narrative, require mental agility from a reader, no less than does attempted definition of the speech act of these 3 lines. We expect narrative, but we must readjust to read petition, Lord, hunt me not. The tiny passage is driven by paradox. The inanimate, animate voice promises but fails as a subject, even as it does the speaking. The inanimate, animate is either a thing broken in pieces or a hunted animal, but not quite a human, despite being a speaker. It, thing or animal, is, again paradoxically, a thing forgot, calling attention to its multiply fragmented state and status as a thing, vibrantly remembered precisely by being painfully forgotten. The extremity of such intensely alienated experience leaves the human speaker as agent, but speaking as a broken thing. The first 3 lines of Affliction 4 then establish such pattern of disruption as is perceptible across the entire poem, which continues thus: my thoughts are all a case of knives, wounding my heart with scattered smart. As watering pots give flowers their lives, nothing their fury can control, while they do wound and prick my soul. All my attendants are at strife, quitting their place unto my face. Nothing performs the task of life, the elements are let loose to fight, and while I live, try out their right. Oh, help, my God, let not their plot kill them and me, and also thee who art my life. Dissolve the knot, as the sun scatters by his light all the rebellions of the night. Then shall those powers which work for grief enter thy pay, and day by day labour thy praise and my relief, with care and courage building me till I reach heaven, and much more thee. Line 4 regains the tetrameter of line 1 and manages almost to catch up conceptually with the surprising leaps of lines 1 to 3, so as to define this rapid and disorienting status of fragmentation, thing, animal, human, once a poor creature, now a wonder. But the wonder itself produces a further surprise. How is the thing, animal, not quite human, become a wonder? We learn through the startling definition in the following line. Each line of the first stanza radically redefines and stretches the previous line. The wonder here is of the pathetic freak variety, a spirit so tortured, a wonder tortured in the space, as to attract the gaze of lurid, shocked fascination. As in Herbert's The Temper, number 1, the sinner presents himself as undergoing torture, literal torture, by God, or metaphorical torture, I guess. There we find Herbert crying with a pun from the rack to his torturing creditor, God. Stretch or contract me, thy poor debtor. It's a brilliant pun. Stretch or contract me, thy poor debtor. The call to contract, in the legal sense, contract the debtor, underlines the fact that this God has abjured contracts. This God's not interested in contracts. And so God is contracting the sinner in the torture chamber. This is one of those racks that will pull and then contract the tortured person. So in Affliction 4, the horrid wonder of the torture chamber announces the extremity to which the voice has arrived, and at which it remains for the rest of this remarkable poem. Distinctively human thoughts morph terrifyingly into menacingly trenchant, inhuman things, a case of knives. And even if they slide then into weird parallelism with sources of biological fertility, a wonder-nourishing pot, a flower-nourishing water pot. The politics of the psyche are in revolutionary but wholly unresolved, febrile rebellion. This is the tortured experience of hanging suspended between the world and grace. There is no escape from this experience of self-fragmentation, since only God, in whose all initiative lies, can dissolve the knot. Human virtue is not even registered as a source of appeal to God, so much so that the appeal to God to dissolve the knot rings very much like the agonized cry of the tortured victim, begging his torture to end the agony by inflicting no more pain. The poem must effectively recede from its ostensible speech act, i.e. appealing to God to act, in recognizing that God has already acted from the beginning of time. Performativity is transactional. It changes things in the world. But there can be no transaction with the early modern God. And so language must lose and be seen to lose one of its essential functions in addressing that God. All the decisions, all the actions have already happened. There are no transactions to happen, so you can't be transactional with God. You can't change things in the world with words, because this God has already acted. Absolutely. Virtue for others is nowhere to be seen in this artifact, eclipsed as it is by the expression of Herbert's own agony and imagined recovery. The recovery does, to be sure, involve care and courage. Down second last line there. Does involve care and courage, but that is therapeutic care and courage by the forces of Herbert's soul applied to Herbert himself. Courage, presumably, being needed to offer therapy to God's victim. That's a courageous act. The tortured experience of suspension, attending wholly upon an inscrutable and entirely silent, menacing divine grace, not only eclipses virtue, but also pulverizes, or at least fragments, language itself. The statement of satisfaction at which the poem arrives is only ever imagined as being in the future. Then shall those powers. It's not happening now. So Affliction 4 raises the related profiles of two features of Calvinist elegy: the terrible psychological wear and tear of being wholly subject to grace, a wonder tortured in the space betwixt this world and that of grace, terrible psychological wear and tear, and the linguistic consequences of that wear and psychological tear, whereby the linguistic construction of the poem remains perforce broken, made as it is, with pieces broken all asunder. Metrical pieces, narrative pieces, syntactic pieces. Both these features, psychological wear and tear and linguistic fragmentation, displace any interest in the path of virtue to salvation. So these two phenomena of psychopathology and linguistic self-neutralization are inseparable in the Calvinist elegiac poem. Different elegies by Herbert accentuate one or other of these same features. Take, for example, the holdfast for the experience of linguistic breaking and undoing. I threatened to observe the strict decree of my dear God with all my power and might. But I was told by one it could not be, yet I might trust in God to be my light. Then I will trust, said I, in him alone. Nay, even to trust in him was also his. We must confess that nothing is our own. Then I confess that he my succour is. But to have naught is ours, not to confess that we have naught. I stood amazed at this, much troubled, till I heard a friend express that all things were more ours by being his. What Adam had and forfeited for all, Christ keepeth now, who cannot fail or fall. Herbert rehearses the inevitable linguistic consequences of relying solely on God's grace, radically dependent on divine gift alone. Language must check its own agency at every syntactic and semantic turn. The elegy thus performs a sequence of linguistic deprivations, subtractions, whereby each verb carrying any sense of agency must be neutralized, whether it be observe, trust, or confess. These verbs are each meek in sense. They express, after all, devoted subservience. But devoted subservience is itself a form of agency, and so, therefore, of insubordination, performed with all my power and might. Such subservience must therefore itself be seen to be disallowed. The speaker must be stripped of the gross pretension of these meek verbs before the absolutist God. The speaker must, that is, be estranged from even his most subservient agency and language, whereby he will rely on nothing but faith in the estranging God. That faith is placed under maximal demand precisely because the speaker is so completely estranged from the absolutist God. What is most intimately ours is what is least intelligible to us as ours. All things were more ours by being his. The holdfast represents a sequence of exponentially greater linguistic deprivations, prompted by the Calvinist surveillance of the friend. On rereading, however, we see that the voiced must already know in its first two lines that it is headed down a linguistic hole. I threatened to observe the strict decree of my dear God with all my power and might. To put the matter in this way is already to understand that language is really on the edge of collapse, since to threaten to observe, threaten to obey, in this context must inflict damage on the word threaten, not least because this is obedience that can only be described as disobedience. The holdfast is, in Stanley Fisher's perceptive formulation, 1971, a self-consuming artifact, but not of what Fish blandly calls the Christian tradition. It is the self-consuming artifact of the early modern absolutist theological Christian tradition, a tradition whose God imposes a strict degree only to underline the impossibility of its fulfillment and also the gross effrontery of any human ever trying to fulfill it. We can only hold fast by letting go. Agency is so deeply embedded in the syntactic structure of any utterance that the conscious effort of undoing it will quickly exhaust and demoralize. For the terrible psychological desire for self-annihilation that must accompany this exhausting neutralization of the self's deepest linguistic instincts and resources, for that terrible psychological desire for self-annihilation, we turn to the final three stanzas of Herbert's Affliction 1. Yet lest perchance I should too happy be in my unhappiness, turning my purge to food, thou throwest me into more sicknesses. Thus doth thy power cross-bias me, not making thine own gift good, yet me from my ways taking. Now I am here, what thou wilt do with me, none of my books will show. I read and sigh and wish I were a tree. For sure then I should grow to fruit or shade, at least some bird would trust her household to me, and I should be just. Yet though thou troublest me, I must be meek, in weakness must be stout. Well, I will change the service and go seek some other master out. Ah, my dear God, though I am clean forgot, let me not love thee, if I love thee not. Subtraction sets the pattern of these stanzas as much as of the holdfast. The shorter three-stress lines jolt the expectations of the tetrameter lines that precede them. Too happy in mine unhappiness. God cruelly turns vomit to food, damages bodily health, seems to forget the speaker. God uses his instrument of salvation to inflict torture. He twists or cross-biases the speaker so as to deprive him of any sense of goodness or security in the familiarity of the cross. Instead, he estranges Herbert and his deepest instincts from any sense of safety, not making, says Herbert to God, thine own gift good, yet me from my ways taking. The grace of the cross adds up only for Herbert to greater solitary pain, greater subtraction. The cross, this strange and uncouth thing, as Herbert says in another elegy, the cross becomes an instrument of torture. These cross actions do wind a rope about and cut my heart. The cross serves to unbend all my abilities. The exemplarity of books is utterly neutralized as well by this practice of divine expropriation. What thou wilt do with me, none of my books will show. So too, by implication, does the divine expropriation neutralize the exemplarity of the very book that we are reading, written by Herbert himself. Agency is wholly God's, wholly unpredictable, and wholly then of the daunting moment of the poem's own utterance. History is demolished. This is a God who exhausts, prompting only exhausting paradox from Herbert's waning linguistic and therefore psychological energies. On the one hand, Herbert wishes himself a different species, less vulnerable to exhausting pain and able to participate in some kind of virtue. He longs to stop being human, to revert to a simpler biological form that participates in exchanges of trust and justice of sorts. I read and sigh and wish I were a tree. At least some bird would trust her household to me, and I should be just. Herbert's desire for self-dissolution is not as extreme as the literary Wittenbergians, teacher and student, Faustus and Hamlet. Both these figures also long for bodily dissolution and for complete bodily disappearance. Thus Marlowe's Faustus implores mountains and hills to fall on me and hide me from the heavy wrath of heaven. Failing that, he will run into the earth. Recognizing no welcome entrance there, he implores the stars to draw up Faustus like a foggy mist into the entrails of yon labouring cloud, that when you that when you vomit forth into the air, my limbs may issue from your smoky mouths, but let my soul mount and ascend to heaven. Hamlet longs for dissolution either through natural causes or suicide. He does so prompted by different causes, but he too wishes that his too sullied flesh would melt, thaw, dissolve itself into a dew, or that God had not forbidden suicide. Herbert, by contrast, longs to recover relations of justice and generosity in the biological world, even if he passionately wishes that he might be released from being human. He longs to become a tree with protective canopy of shade and appreciated produce of fruit. He longs to become a life form in which trust and just rhyme, as they so painfully fail to rhyme in Calvinist relations of human and divine. On the one hand, and no less suddenly, Herbert wishes himself back into God's good grace. Ah, my dear God, even in his forgotten state, let me not love thee if I love thee not. This unfulfilled wish, however, takes us back into a predicament where trust and just fail to rhyme. For if God is capable of extinguishing Herbert's love, so too is he responsible for the capacity to love in the first place. In recoiling back to a tortured and torturing relation with God as the only avenue open to humans, Herbert finds himself back on the rack of observing the exhaustingly impossible demand of deactivating his own determination to love. In conclusion, religious literature itself feels under an existential challenge, threat, in the period of our early modernity. Calvinist doctrine takes literary discourse to the edge of a precipice, even as it pushed visual religious imagery over that precipice. Again, legislated for more than a century, legislated iconoclasm of every single religious image in Britain between 1538 and 1644. Calvinist doctrine takes literary discourse, yanks it to the edge of the same precipice, the one over which it had pushed religious visual imagery. Extraordinary Calvinist elegiac poetry is immensely and intensely precious, not only because it exemplifies language working in extraordinarily illuminating ways. It's more precious because it tenaciously retains the agential capacity for expression under the astonishing, extreme, legislated, existential threat posed by the absolutist religion of our ongoing modernity. Thank you very much. Thank you. I've never given a talk with a mask on. A tip, one faints. There's not enough oxygen. But I'm still standing.
So we have some time for questions, and I guess you don't need me to call on people.
Okay, I'm very happy to chair. It's Raina.
Yes, thank you.
Raina.
Thank you for that wonderful talk. It was really fascinating. And as I was listening to your reading of these poems, which I love,
Sorry, the poems you love or the readings?
No,
I'm not putting you on the spot.
No, really, they're beautiful readings, really tremendous readings. And but I guess I want to ask you to follow up on that idea of pushing language to the precipice, because, and I think I want to ask another question, which is about your use of the absolutist Calvinist.
Yeah.
And ask you about, in taking language to the precipice, is that also not enabling a kind of beautiful rebellion, right? That is, there's so much rebellion in Herbert's poetry, and part of what makes it so compelling is that, to me, the way that it breaks from standard syntax, standard lineation. And so I guess one of my questions is it also possible that, and I'm going to add one other little detail. You had this wonderful moment in reading Affliction where you talked about the language of petition coming forward. And so my question is, does this absolutist God also enable a linguistic and political rebelliousness that has its own energy and agency, even as it is a kind of self-denial and self-effacement?
Right, thank you. Well, just to take the occasion of your beautifully put question, Raina, to underline the absolutism, I'll do that, and then I will answer the precise force of your question. The standard view of historiography is that the 16th and 17th centuries are the age of absolutism. This is an absolutely commonplace term. But nevertheless, Reformation historiography persists obstinately, and in my view, entirely incorrectly, almost entirely incorrectly, to think of Protestant religion as anti-absolutist, as decentralizing, as giving voice to the individual. Well, in my view, this is 100% or 99% wrong. Protestant theology is of its time. Sorry, I think for COVID reasons I'm too close to you. Protestant theology is of its time. It too is massively absolutist. The God who decides before you've lifted a finger, before the creation of the world, whether or not you'll be saved or damned, regardless therefore, of your initiative, of your effort, of your merit, that God is an absolutist God. Everything from that God is dependent on his grace or gift. You can't predict him in any way. We like to think of gifts as nice, cute things. Yes, but not when it's your eternal salvation or damnation, which is at stake. We like to think there that you have a chance to contribute in substantial ways to a kind of contract. We like to think that there is a contract. But no, such is not the case with Protestant theology. I think it's difficult to overstate, over-repeat this essential point, because it's the core error, the core of a whole sequence, a whole flourishing forest of error by Protestant historiography. So that larger point having been made, you make the very astute point that this is fantastically beautiful poetry. This is so precious. This is where the meanings are. And so I 100% agree with that, which may sound like a dull answer. But I was kind of hoping that it'd be obvious from my close reading of his poems that I love this poetry. I just think people have got Herbert wrong. Herbert, the gorgeous Herbert, wrong by regarding him as a beautiful, kindly, via media, Anglican, country church poet. He is that in part. He's a gorgeous friend to have. But he's much, much more interesting than that. Calvinists are much more interesting than liberals would give them credit. And Herbert is an paid up Calvinist, and there are lyrics in Herbert's corpus which are incredibly dark. I hope I've persuaded you of that. So I think Herbert's textuality is brilliant and beautiful and precious in a way that a bit of metal sparks in glory before it extinguishes. A firecracker. It's pyrotechnic. That's the aesthetic quality of its beauty. But one final point. These poems do enact rebellion. Rebellion, is that the word? They do enact resistance of sorts precisely by pretending not to. And that's why the poetry is so precious. Because the images don't do that. The images really did disappear. We don't have any religious imagery of the 16th and 17th century. The English visual tradition is actually broken. You're a Renaissance person. So is Philip. There are other Renaissance people, lots of you, no doubt, in this room. You will correct me. In my view, the poetry is all the more precious, given the savage and effective attack on the visual religious tradition in 16th and 17th century Britain. So they're close competitors. The visual is gone, in my view. The textual is immensely precious for being where the pyrotechnic flash of agony shows itself most finely articulated. For a second. Thank you. We have a question up here.
For what it's worth, as you were reading these poems, I've heard of these, and I think I've read them years ago, but I've forgotten. That as Herbert kind of, is one of his evidences is kind of cancelled out, or runs afoul of Calvinism, then he backs up and tries again, then he backs up and tries again. Who I was reminded of was Samuel Beckett in those 3 short novels of his. or he will not shut up. But he's talking to nothingness, but he will not shut up. It's the same kind of propulsion and backing up and going forward and so forth.
Well, I wish I could think of a quotation from Beckett to agree with you, but I can't. I totally agree with you. Beckett, too, is the poet who's undoing language, he's slowing language down. He's uncovering the mysterious depths of the simplest, shortest statements. And that is what's happening here. These poets, Beckett, I think, is a brilliant comparator for the linguistic dismantling, syntactic, narrative, metrical dismantling that's going on in these poems of subtraction. Yes, thank you. Yeah.
Actually, now I have 2 questions after those questions. I'm curious, especially thinking back to what Reina mentioned about the beauty of the poetry.
Could you just speak more slowly with these masks on, and I have bad ears?
Yeah, sure. I have 2 questions. The first is somewhat related to Reina's question and the idea of like the beauty of the poetry coming out of these moments of rebellion and resistance. And I'm really struck by the line about I wish I were a tree. And if you see that in like an Ovidian tradition at all, with Philomela coming, out of like a transformation and Ovid often transforming people into trees. And then the second question is if you see these all at all in relation to like the continental traditions, because so many of the themes that you've mentioned, like fragmentation and agonized subject, the broken subject, or literally the subject distance from this description or description, seemed very baroque to me. And so I'm wondering if you see these things in an Ovidian light, and also how you see them in relation to continental.
Yeah. So Ovid and the Baroque. I hadn't thought of Ovid, but Apollo and Daphne, let me be a tree. Sort of escape being human, having a God chasing me as a human. I can't say that I'm not confident to say that this is an Ovidian reference. Perhaps you are. I'd be delighted to hear that. But I love the idea that so many of Ovidian metamorphoses are about escaping. Think of Philomela, escaping the condition of being human by changing species. That's an extreme expression of the agony of being human. So I love the idea and principle. As to the Baroque, I really can't. There is a long tradition that's by no means only from Petrarch of the divided self, but this has been in love poetry, not in religious poetry. Medieval religious poetry doesn't have. Andy Galloway's about to disagree, I feel sure. He knows so much more. Perhaps others will. Medieval poetry doesn't have this equivalent. Why do we love the 17th century devotional lyric so much? Because it's so astonishing. It's working on such a fine boundary line with a terrible precipice beside it all the time. But as to Baroque poetry, then I'm afraid you're asking the wrong person. I just don't know. I'm a complete thief in the night with regard to Renaissance studies. I shouldn't be here. And occasionally I'm caught out. But I've grown past the age of being embarrassed about it. But thank you, yeah. Andy.
Well, actually, I wasn't thinking backwards. I was thinking forwards. One of the narratives of liberalism is the economic sort of self-sufficiency and productivity and the valuing of your work and your creditworthiness. And a lot of the metaphors in Herbert have an economic valence to them. The hold fast, for example, or what's mine isn't mine. But it's a very principle is a Weberian kind of notion of a deferred value, but it's extremely central to a lot of these. And I wondered if you had thoughts about how, I don't mean to make this a kind of whataboutism, but thoughts about how this relates to not just the ecclesiological discourse that's there, but also the economic discourse that seems in a way contradictory to the ecclesiological claims of no merit and no value and loss of self and so on. Is that a paradox or is that?
Yeah. Well, I certainly agree there's lots and lots of economic discourse, but I don't think it's paradoxical or at odds with the theological absolutism. There are two fundamental relationships between Christians and God, and they're both economic in basis. One is Christian as wage earner, and the other is Christian as gift receiver. The late medieval theology, whether it be Aquinian 13th century theology or semi-Pelagianism of the 14th and 15th century, goes for one version or another of the Christian as deserving of a wage. Semi-Pelagianism, we could go into it, does it much more, in a much more sophisticated, truly brilliant way, I think. But you deserve a wage. So Christian theology has always been economic. Forgive us our debita is the Latin for trespassers. But the other tradition is gift. And that's the tradition. Luther, who was trained as a semi-Pelagian, breaks through the complex dialectic of gift and wage in semi-Pelagianism and just absolutely trashes wage altogether and insists on grace. And that's where evangelical religion has remained ever since. My point is that I hadn't thought about it in terms of liberalism, but it's not liberalism in the world of contract. Not at all. Liberalism comes out of evangelical religion by rejecting it. The weak tradition is a profoundly conflicted, self-conflicted tradition. One reviewer of Permanent Revolution said Simpson thinks of the liberal tradition as a Protestant heresy. And I think that's a beautifully put point. Yeah, I think liberalism is a Protestant heresy. Thank goodness. So the fact that liberalism relies on contract and evangelical theology relies on gift is not a contradiction. It's the logic of a historical tradition based on internal contradiction or internal repudiation. The second is a reflex of the first. So that's how I see it. Living in a world of pure gift is to live in an experience of pure terror. Alexis.
First of all, thank you for this wonderful talk. I am going to think backwards, of course. So I've been thinking about this idea, right, of Protestant, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Of Protestant desire for self-annihilation.
Yeah.
Can we think about that in relationship to desires for self-annihilation in earlier mystical thinking? Because I also kept thinking, right, like with all of this disintegrating language, I kept thinking about apophatic theology. So I was wondering, like, are these texts in conversation with those kinds of texts? And is this kind of self-annihilation different from mystical self-annihilation? And if so, how?
Yeah, there's a very marginal late medieval tradition of apophatic theology, whose most famous expression is by the cloud of unknowing author who wrote a series of tracts based on Duns Scotus Eriugena and the so-called pseudo-Dionysian tradition. And that figure does keep on saying it's apophatic. It's straight, pure, very articulate apophatic theology, saying the only thing we know about God is what he's not. So therefore we've got to keep on breaking every image we have. There's a kind of iconoclastic, verbal iconoclasm embedded necessarily in that tradition. It's a very marginal tradition, in my view. It's the opposite of the main lines of devotional theology in terms of aesthetics, emotional experience of theology, and it's also, it's just not interested in taking sides with lines of soteriology, late medieval soteriology. But what's interesting about it is that apophatic tradition actually becomes Protestantism, or feeds very directly into Protestantism. So, because Protestantism is apophatic, Luther's God is always the Deus alienis, the God as stranger. We could go on about that, but that's the essence that's the real essence of Luther's so-called breakthrough in his Tower experience. So I think that late medieval tradition is useful because there's an axiom of cultural history. This is one of my axioms, I'm sure it belongs to lots of other people as well, that if something spectacular happens in cultural history, start looking backwards. You're going to see the earth trembling. You're going to feel tremors underground, even if it's not spectacular, from quite a while beforehand. And I think that's what you're pointing to, Alexis. The Cloud author is detonating tremors that are going to become much more dominant. I mean, there are other theologians too. Brandegard, Archbishop of Canterbury, total predestinarian, late Augustinian theology. So here and there we can see different forms of absolutism. We can feel the ground trembling, but it doesn't erupt. Yeah, okay.
And can I just follow up about self-annihilation?
Yeah, I'm talking too much. You're not asking too many questions, but I'm talking too much. Self-annihilation. Yeah, well, the Cloud author, is all about self-annihilation. We've got to get rid of all this material, straight Platonist. But there are other forms of self-annihilation. All the devotional piety, I want to be, all that stuff. I want to be covered in sores and, that sort of thing. It's not my thing. I don't have very much sympathy with it. No, this is not an answer.
What's its relationship to Herbert's kind of self?
I think I have the answer. It's not about self-annihilation. It's about the experience of disgust. That stuff. I want you to suck my pussy wounds, all that. You perhaps come across this. Anyway, it's not about. It is about the body in its worst, most distasteful expressions. I want that en plus. It's not about self-annihilation. I think I may have a ground to push back on that, if that's what you were thinking of.
I don't want to take up too much space. I'm sure there are other questions.
Yeah, I think there are other questions. Could we have as many questions as there are so that we're sure? Got one here and one there. We've got two more questions. Right, so at the very back, please.
First of all, thank you very much for your talk. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how the sort of consequences of this absolutist God and the imagination of the relationship between human beings and Christ as the sort of savior and exemplar. I was thinking about this because sort of in Affliction 4, it starts very much talking about this broken, tortured thing that has been hunted but become wondrous, which is kind of a repetition of the sort of narrative of Christ and of the saints' lives that follow in that sequence, but then departs from that to a kind of different understanding of the relationship between sort of Christ, God, as an absolutist predeterminer of time and everything, and the kind of writer of the poems herself.
Yeah, I'll be very quick, I promise. I don't see the huge distinction between God the Father and God the Son that I see everywhere in medieval devotional writing. Everywhere there's God the Father as the source of justice, who is terrifying, and God the Son, the source of mercy, who will intercede for us. I don't see that. I could be wrong. I don't see it emphasized anywhere near to that degree. Instead, I see God the Son either as wholly absorbed into this truly, in my view, terrifying and how shall I put it, rebarbative God the Father, who's the absolutist, who only works by grace. I see God the Son as wholly absorbed by that God, or else I see just plain confusion. A certain amount of stuff as, Christ is our merciful Saviour and so on. But it's not correlated. Every time I'm reading that in evangelical materials, the 16th and 17th century, I'm saying, but what about the mainline soteriology? There's so much stuff that becomes irrelevant. Or at least, it becomes irrelevant, effectively, if your main core belief is predestination. So that's how I see that. Christ is, he's absorbed, or Christian talk about Christ is just confused. There's a question here.
Yeah, I just want to ask you about the question of endings in Herbert. So many of Herbert's poems end in epiphanies, right? They end in sudden reevaluations of everything that's gone before, which usually represent, more often some kind of reassurance, right? Including here in this poem, and then holds fast. And so, even though you can't say that assurance is earned by the preceding lines, there's a sense in which the revelation, the epiphany, wouldn't exist without the struggle and without the writing of the previous lines. So there's a sense in which activity, however much it's self-canceling, produces that which it most desires, at least in the ones where there's a positive epiphany. And so I guess this is maybe a sort of restatement or a deepening of Raina's question about the necessary presence of resistance just in the mere fact of writing. But it also maybe relates to Andy's question about the question of work and of labor, which at least in Weber's account is all about proving or demonstrating that you are elected, right? Of giving yourself signs and of manifesting in work. So it does seem like there is in this tradition still some kind of motivation for activity, right? Still something that's produced by activity. So I'm wondering about the question of time and endings here.
Yeah, I think your literary criticism is extremely persuasive. I think your account of Weber is incorrect. People mistake Weber's capitalism and the spirit, people, in my view, get it seriously back to front. What Weber says, in my view, is, do Protestants work all the time? He said, yes, they do. And why do they work all the time? Is it because they believe that works are going to save them? No. They work all the time because they know that works won't save them. They know the decision's already been taken. So why are they working? Because Protestant theology says that your works are a sign. Works have been redefined from being currency to being sign, pure sign of a decision already having been taken. That's why I'm a Protestant. I know about this stuff. I'm always working. I really speak with inner passion about this. I think Weber had it exactly right. Works for Protestants is pure neurosis. It's like riding a bike without a chain. There's no traction. There's no amount of work that we can do that will satisfy us because it's all to do with neurosis. So that's what, in my view, Weber brilliantly says about works. So we return to the beautifully put, articulate literary criticism that you gave, and say that it too must fall under the subject of a kind of neurosis. One of the brilliant things about these poems, or at least illuminating things for which we should be eternally grateful, is that these too are neurotic. These poems. This is going to happen again tomorrow. You know, if everything's dependent on gift, there is no contract. There's nothing you can rely on. It's going to happen again tomorrow. I feel great today because I've been working. You know, this is a sign. But the day after, you know, I don't feel so good. I work. What's going on? Maybe it wasn't a sign yesterday. That's the predicament, the Protestant predicament, that leads to all the suicide that John Stachniewski so demonstrably, in my view, documents. Thank you. I think we have no more questions.
So please join me in thanking Professor Simpson.